Most people associate burning at the stake with witches, but in a case at York, a woman was convicted of killing her husband, and the sentence meted out was exactly that. Elizabeth Boardingham was married to a convicted smuggler, John Boardingham, who was doing time at York Castle. They lived in the pretty fishing village of Flamborough with their 5 children: Mary, born 1766, Anne, John, Robert and Thomas, who was born in 1775. While John was serving his sentence, she lived with Thomas Akeney, or Hackney as some sources cite, of Thwing in Yorkshire, who was 6 years her senior. When her husband was released, she continued to stay with her lover. This caused outrage, as she was openly being an adulteress. Boardingham was a sailor by profession, but also a serial smuggler, spending stints in prison, while Elizabeth looked after their children. She'd become disillusioned by her husband and began to seek solace elsewhere. In October 1775, she ran away with Akeney to Lincolnshire, leaving behind her husband and children. With the situation being ever more complicated, Elizabeth tried to persuade her lover to murder her husband. It was her belief that if her husband was dead, Tom and her would be married and no longer live like a whore and rogue, as they had sometime done. To begin with, he would have nothing to do with it, being struck by horror at her words, declaring he would never imbrue his hands in innocent blood. But as time went on, she continued to nag him about it, and eventually managed to persuade him to carry out the deed. That night she had plied him with drink, and when completely intoxicated, he agreed. She returned to the marital home, where her husband welcomed her with open arms. Akeney, once he'd sobered up, tried to persuade her that they should elope rather than murder her husband, but she was having none of it. 8 days after she'd returned home, on 14th February 1776, her plan was executed. At around 11 o'clock that night, she woke her sleeping husband and told him someone was knocking at the door. The unsuspecting husband, thinking it could be a friend or neighbour, put on his coat and waistcoat and went down the stairs, where Akeney was waiting for him, and pounced. Elizabeth had left the door unlocked for Akeney to gain entry into the house. Akeney, who'd taken lodgings nearby and had waited for Elizabeth to summon him, stabbed Thomas, first in the thigh, then cut him across the belly, leaving the knife in his body, having driven it upwards into his ribs as he fled. The injured man staggered into the street, and the cry of murder went up. Their neighbours began rushing out of their homes and saw the injured man, his hands bloodied where he was drawing out the knife and supporting his bowels, which were falling from his body. He survived into the next day, but succumbed to the dreadful injuries he'd sustained, dying a painful death. Police soon caught the culprit. Akeney had left the vital evidence of the knife behind, and when questioned by police, immediately confessed to the killing. He also told them that Elizabeth repeatedly goaded him, and she too was arrested for the murder. Both made full confessions at court in Flamborough. However, at the trial before Judge Sir Henry Goulding, Elizabeth told him she'd known nothing about the plot to kill her husband, and maintained this throughout the trial, right up until her execution. She never showed any remorse during the trial or afterwards. Aikney, on the other hand, did show remorse and accepted his fate. At court, 9-year-old Mary Boardingham identified the knife that had been recovered from the bloody scene as belonging to Aikney. On Wednesday, 20th March 1776, both met their ends at York. At midday they were taken to Tyburn, where York Racecourse is today, with 40-year-old Aikney being taken by cart, while Elizabeth was taken on a hurdle or sledge. Aikney was hanged at York Castle, then cut down, his body sent to Leeds, where it was dissected at the infirmary by surgeons. But Elizabeth had been convicted of petty treason and for aiding and abetting the crime, so the punishment was more cruel. The judge had told her that she was to be burnt with fire until she died, then her body was to be consumed to ashes. However, in an act of mercy, she was to be strangled first. The couple lived out their final weeks together in a cell in the jail, and it's said they shook hands and saluted each other before they died. Aikney was hanged first. Elizabeth was tied to a stake, strangled first before the flames could take hold of her, and her body burned. She was 34 years old. Thousands of people turned out to see their executions. Right up until the 1790s, women were burned at the stake in England for serious crimes. As for John, when he passed away, he was buried in St Oswald's churchyard in Flamborough. There is no marker for his wife.